Welcome, First Church family and friends. It is so good to be gathering with you today for Church at Home. It's a beautiful day, and I'm excited that we have the opportunity to worship together. No matter where you are, we believe that Jesus is here. Just a couple of things before we get started. Let me remind you that you can visit us at our church website, CherokeeFCC.com, to find out more about us as a church. Also, we encourage you to click on the links provided on whichever platform you're viewing the service today to fill out a digital Connect card, and you can give financially if you feel led to do that. We also encourage you to connect by engaging in the online chat. If you're viewing this morning through our church online platform, just type the word hello there and let us know you're here. Also, feel free to submit a prayer request or to ask questions. Again, I'm excited because it's going to be a great time together. In just a little bit, I'll be sharing the first message from the series, Revelation, When the Church Comes to Jesus. The message is entitled, Suffering Faithfully. You know, the promise of God to His church is that when it comes to Jesus, it finds hope for a future that allows us to suffer patiently, knowing that it won't last forever. I believe God has something to say to each one of us on this topic today. And so sit back and get ready to lean into what it is God has in store for us. It is going to be an amazing time, and I am so glad that you are here.
We got a lot to celebrate around here. God is doing some cool stuff. So let's sing this out together. Youth, I want to hear you. Come on, we sing. There's a song that stirs the spirit, and it's calling hearts to life. It's an anthem in the making. Can you feel it start to rise? Can you hear the generations getting louder all the time? Every son and every daughter singing out into the night. Come on! It's not time to be silent. Don't you dare hide your light. There's a world outside your window, so don't let it pass you by. Lift your hands to the heavens, lift your voice to the sky. Praise the Lord of all creation, let His name be lifted high. Sing it, oh, whoa. From the palace to the streets, I can feel that drumbeat pulsing, and it's calling you and me. I can hear the world awaken, oh, the sound is heavenly. Every tribe and every nation singing Jesus, I believe. Yeah. It's not time to be silent, don't you dare. There's a world outside the window, so don't let it pass you by. Lift your hands to the heavens, lift your voice to the sky. Praise the Lord of all creation, let His name be lifted high. Sing it, oh, whoa. Nowhere in sight, for the Lord, He is alive. See the lost return from the dead of the night, every captive freed, every chain left behind. Have you ever seen such a beautiful sight? All the world coming alive. See the world light up, one heart at a time. See the strongholds break in the blink of an eye. Death and all our sin, nowhere in sight, for the Lord, He is alive. See the lost return from the dead of the night, every captive freed, every chain left behind. Have your hands to the heavens, lift your voice to the sky. Praise the Lord of all creation, let his name be lifted high. Come on, we got a lot to celebrate. Let's keep it going.
I know y'all know this one. Come on, sing with me. I raise a hallelujah in the presence of my enemy. I raise a hallelujah louder than the unbelief. I raise a hallelujah. My weapon is a melody. I raise a hallelujah. Heaven comes to fight I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Hey, come on! Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Y'all sound great. You are here, touching every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You are healing every heart, healing every heart. I worship you. I worship you. You're turning lives around. You are healing, turning lives around. I worship you. I worship you. You're mending every heart. You are here, and you're mending every heart. I worship you, yeah. I worship you. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. It's who you are, it's what you do, yeah, yeah. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Y'all sing it again. Hey, come on. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. It's who you are, yeah, yeah. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. 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 Come on, y'all, help me out. That is who you are. 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 Miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. It's who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Even when I don't see it, you're working. And even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop, no, never stop working. And even when I don't see it, you're working. And even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop. Even when I don't see it, you're working. And even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. And even when I don't see it, you're working. And even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. Y'all sing that again with me one more time. Hey. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are.
Tomorrow is Halloween here in our country. And you know, whether kids walk the streets of the neighborhood, have a costume parade at their school, or wander in a church parking lot at a trunk or treat, almost all children participate in some sort of Halloween type event. And the concept is simple. Children put on a disguise, pretend to be somebody else, and they head out in search of what they really want: candy. You know, for kids, Halloween comes once a year. But if you think about it, adults put on disguises much more frequently. On any given day, many of us pretend to be someone we're not. We disguise our true motives, our intentions, all in an attempt to get what we want. But instead of candy, we seek fame and power, wealth, attention, status. Even as Christians, we can begin to think that we've got to protect the right image or project the right image of ourselves or to be something that we're not, to get what we really want. That's one reason that communion is so important. When we come to the table, we're reminded not only of God's love and forgiveness, but also that we have a new identity and purpose, not dependent upon anything that we do, but which comes from Christ Himself. The Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1, verses 27 and 28 and said, "The glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. He is the one that we proclaim, admonishing and teaching everyone with all wisdom, so that we may present everyone fully mature in Christ." Because of Christ, Paul said that there is no need to put on a show or pretend to be somebody that we aren't. Christ accepts us as we are, and He's transforming us to become more and more like Him. And so today, as we commune together, let's remember we don't need to pretend to be someone else to be accepted and valued. Instead, we can celebrate that Christ is our redemption, our hope, and our glory.
I remember your broken body, your blood and tears so overcoming. I remember you took bitterness, you bore my shame, you bore my sickness. Break the bread, drink the wine, come sup with me. Break the bread, drink the wine, come sup with me.
Since its inception, the church has struggled against the face of persecution. Stephen became the first follower of Jesus to die for his faith, stoned to death for speaking out against the religious leaders of that day. His execution sparked mass persecution across Jerusalem. 10 years later, James would become the first apostle to be executed, followed by all the other disciples except for John, who was exiled to an island and then died of natural causes. As Christianity spreads throughout the Roman Empire, so does persecution. In 64 AD, Nero burns Rome for his new palace, killing thousands of Romans. When the emperor is suspected, he blames the Christians, who are then doused with pitch and used as human torches to light the palace. That same year, Peter is crucified upside down, and the Apostle Paul is beheaded. In 160 AD, the Apostle John appoints Polycarp as a bishop of the Christian church. Later, he is threatened to recant his beliefs. He responds, 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Then they burn Polycarp at the stake. 203 AD, Perpetua, the daughter of an affluent man, is beheaded in front of her father for not recanting Jesus Christ. Perpetua assists her executioners when the sword gets stuck halfway through her neck. 1,000 years go by, faith goes global, persecution follows. July 6, 1415. John Huss and William Tyndale are both burned at the stake for translating the Bible into their own language, English. This was the first step for the Protestant Reformation in Europe. Japan, 1630. 300,000 Christians are executed by beach crucifixion, upside down in the morning low tide, so they wouldn't drown until the tide came in at the end of the day. 20th century, the bloodiest century in the history of the church. World War II, Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer was put to death in 1945 for refusing to comply with Hitler's plot against the Jews. 1950, Jim Elliot is speared to death by Aucan Indians in South America when he arrives by plane to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. That next summer, his wife comes and baptizes the man that killed her husband. 1975, Chinese pastor Wang Ziming is executed by communist regime. Pastor Ziming attempted to bring freedom of worship to Christians in this oppressed country. 2006, former North Korean army officer Song Jong-nam is arrested by communist leaders for preaching Christianity. He eventually dies in prison. 2010, Afghanistan, Saeed Musa is arrested for converting to Christianity. While facing extreme physical torture, Musa's captors inform him that he will be released if he denies Jesus. He refuses and remains in prison. Word of his plight spreads to the United States. A massive social networking campaign follows, and church and political leaders plead for his release. Finally, after months of captivity, Musa is freed. Persecution of Christians still continues today. In nearly every corner of the world, Christians are told that they cannot worship freely.
Whether it's China or Vietnam, North Korea, Sudan or Nigeria, Iraq and Egypt, Pakistan, India, Christians are the most persecuted group in the world today.
Pastor and author John Ortberg talks about a time in his life when he came face to face with the suffering of this world. He was in seminary when he went to visit a state-run convalescent hospital, and he says that it was full of people who were basically just waiting to die. People who were suffering and senile and lonely, and they were just waiting to die. And so he goes on a Mother's Day to try and spread a little joy to some of the ladies there, and he met a woman named Mabel. And when he met her, she was strapped in a chair. Her face was being eaten by cancer, and so she drooled constantly. He found out that she had been bedridden, blind, and nearly deaf for 25 years living in this hospital. Mabel had grown up on a small farm, and she had helped her mother manage the farm, and then when her mother died, she managed it on her own. But in 1950, the blindness and the sickness sent her to this convalescent hospital. And for 25 years, she got weaker and sicker, constant headaches, backaches, stomach aches. And now the cancer came. Her 3 roommates were all vegetables, basically, who screamed occasionally but never talked. And they often soiled their bedclothes. And because the hospital was sorely understaffed, the stench was often overwhelming. But this was her life. This wasn't just a season of her life. It wasn't just a difficult week or month. This was her life, day after day. Can you think of a time where you came face to face with the pain and suffering of this world? Oh, we live in denial of it. We do our best not to look directly at it. We change the channel as quickly as possible when we're confronted with it. But there comes a point where you just can't get away from it. Maybe it's because you witness it, or maybe it's because you experience it. But eventually you come to the conclusion that there is a lot of hurt, and there is a lot of suffering, and there is a lot of pain in this life. Now, we can do our best to numb it and to escape it, but eventually you can't get away from it. And so in Revelation chapter 6 and 7, we're going to read about the suffering of this world as we study the 7 seals of suffering. Now in chapter 5, you'll remember that we left off with a scroll that had 7 seals. In chapter 6, these seals are opened, and as each seal opens up, it describes, particularly in the first 4, it describes the suffering of this life. Now, these seals are part of 3 sets of judgment that we're going to study in the book of Revelation. There are the 7 seals, there are the 7 bowls, and the 7 trumpets. Now, some people think that what we're reading here is sequential, that we're reading kind of an order of events that will unfold. I tend to think that what we're reading is John describing the same thing from 3 different angles. It's sort of like, you're watching Sports Center and they show you a replay, and then they show it again from a different angle, and then again from a different angle. And seeing it from 3 different camera angles gives you a more complete picture of what's happening. And so I think that's what's happening here as John describes these 3 separate sets of judgment: the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. Now, they're difficult, they're different in that the trumpets and the bowls, as we're going to study in the next few weeks, they parallel the Egyptian plagues. The seals that we're studying today, they don't. And here's why that's significant. The Egyptian plagues were meant for the Egyptians. In other words, the people of God were not the ones impacted directly by the plagues. So that when the angel of death passed through, you'll remember that they had the blood of the lamb on their door frame, and it passed over them. They weren't affected. And so what we're going to study with the bowls and the trumpets, those are not as clearly meant for the people of God. But what we're studying here in the seals, God's people don't seem to be exempt from this pain and from this suffering that's going to be described for us in the next few minutes. Now, look, I want to be clear on this. And some of you are probably already like, well, what in the world is he talking about? I have no idea what's happening here. Well, that's okay. Just stick with me for a few more minutes. Here's what I want to be clear on, though. There are a number of different interpretations as to how and when all of this is going to unfold. And we've said in our study of Revelation that we're not going to get overly caught up with the different interpretations and eschatological terms because it's just endless. And I explained way back in week 1 that my role is going to be like a tour guide, where we're going to stop and we're going to look, and then I'm going to say, we're walking, and we're going to keep moving, because we don't want to miss the big picture, the big revelation that God has for us in this book. And so there are a number of interpretations, and I just want to touch on some of these. For some of you, this is not your cup of tea, right? And others of you, you're going to be really into this. It just depends. But I'm going to move kind of quickly through it, and then you can study some of this on your own if you're interested in doing that. All right. So what we're going to study. To be studying about is often referred to as the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation. In chapter 7, verse 14, you'll read that phrase, Great Tribulation. And what you need to know is that the word tribulation is just a generic term. It doesn't necessarily mean a specific set of time or a specific event. Instead, the word here is just great suffering. In fact, as we studied Revelation, we've already read the word tribulation. It just hasn't been translated that way. It's been suffering. That's all that tribulation means. And so you hear people talk about the Great Tribulation. Well, it means suffering. It means a time, a period of great pressure. Now, there are some people who believe in a literal 7-year tribulation. Now, John doesn't talk about a great tribulation specifically lasting for 7 years. It's not found in the book of Revelation. But some people, taking into account some passages back in the Old Testament book of Daniel, will interpret the tribulation time that we read in Revelation as being specifically 7 years. And that it's going to happen before the return of Christ. And so some people believe in a 7-year literal time of suffering and tribulation that is coming. Now, within that, there are a number of different camps as to what will happen to Christians during the 7-year tribulation. Some people think that before the 7-year tribulation takes place, that there will be a rapture and that Christians, the church, will meet Jesus in the clouds and Christians will be exempt from the 7-year tribulation. And so that interpretation is sometimes called pre-trib. You'll hear it referred to that way. It's that the rapture will occur, the pre-tribulation period. And then there are other people who will interpret it this way. They think that there will be basically 3.5 years of suffering and tribulation that Christians or that the church will be a part of. But then there will be a rapture about halfway, at the halfway point, before things get really bad. And so those people are, or that interpretation is usually called mid-trib. And sometimes you'll hear it referred to as pre-wrath. And so that's another interpretation or school of thought. And then there are those who believe that after the tribulation, which may or may not last 7 years, there will be a rapture and the return of Christ, which will be more simultaneous. And that interpretation typically is referred to as post-trib. Okay? And you know what? We could literally spend weeks kind of breaking down these different arguments and different interpretations, but there are a few things for you to keep in mind here. There are reputable theologians who can make pretty strong biblical cases for their particular interpretation. And so if you ask me, what do you believe? What do I think is the most accurate? I mean, if I'm choosing between, if there really is a 7-year tribulation, a literal 7-year tribulation, and I'm choosing between pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, I'm on the pre-trib team. And here's why. Because if A is no suffering, and B is some suffering, and C is lots of suffering, I'll take door number 1, right? Like if I'm listening to 3 different hermeneutical explanations of Revelation and the tribulation and the rapture, I'm going to lean towards that one. But here's what I want you to catch though. There are a number of different theologians who can kind of make a case for this biblically, right? And we don't want to get too caught up in that for our purposes here. I mean, it can be interesting. I think it can be helpful to study and to learn and to understand some of these things, but it's fairly endless of how you go down these different paths. I read one commentary where the guy wrote, Jesus said we don't know the day, we don't know the hour, but it doesn't mean that we don't know the week and the month. Okay, well, you're kind of missing the point, right? I mean, he's saying there's a lot we don't know, a lot that we don't know. And so it can be helpful to kind of study these things and see these different perspectives. But what I want us to do as we study this together is, again, not look at Revelation as some puzzle that we have to solve or some code that we have to crack or a calendar that we need to fill in. I want us to get what is the big picture? What is the big revelation that Jesus has for us? And I think to help us with that, the best thing for us to do in studying this together is to read the text as if we were the early Christians who received this revelation from God. Because there are many who believe that the Great Tribulation is not necessarily a specific 7-year period, but it's what John's readers were experiencing at that time. It's what many people around the world are experiencing right now. You see, for John's readers, what John is about to describe, they didn't read these things as a series of events to interpret. They read these things to be a current reality that they were trying to endure. And one of the things I've discovered in studying Revelation is how you interpret Revelation has everything to do with where you live and what your life is like. Because if you talk to pastors and churches in third world countries today and very difficult places where suffering is just a way of life, where it's a daily thing, they tend to ask much different questions than many of us in this country or watching and studying this together today would ask. But the two questions they tend to ask in reading the book of Revelation are the same questions John's readers are asking, and we'll see this in a minute. But they're asking, how much longer will it last? It's a very practical question, right? How much longer is this going to last? And they ask, how can I get through this? How much longer will the suffering or the tribulation last, and how can I get through this? And so let's look at chapter 6, starting with verse 1 that reads, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, Come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, Come. And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given the power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, Come. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hands. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures in heaven, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. And when the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, Come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades, or the grave, was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth, 25% of the earth, to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. And so these first 4 seals are opened. And each one, it's like each one pushes, play on a vision for John. And he sees 4 horsemen riding 4 different horses. And so let's look at these different horses for a minute. The first horse is the white horse. And the rider on the white horse carries, did you catch this? What was it? A bow. And verse 2 says he's bent on conquest. Now, there's no shortage of creative interpretations as to what this rider on the white horse, as to what this rider on the white horse carrying a bow may mean in some future tribulation time. But for John's readers, this was not difficult to understand, because they had some neighbors to the east of them, the Parthian warriors, who were the only mounted warriors of the day who were archers. Care to guess what color of horse they generally rode? White. And so he's describing here, as he describes this rider of the white horse, he's describing military conquest. Military conquest. And I just want you to ask yourself if there's ever been a time in history where the white horse has not been riding. From Genghis Khan to Nazi Germany, the white horse rides. And that was true then, and it's true now. And then we read of the red horse. And red is the color of blood and death. And the red horse brings conflict. This rider carries a large sword, and he disrupts peace everywhere that he rides. He turns men and women against each other. Need evidence that the red horse rides? Probably not. But if you do, just turn on the news at any given time and you'll see conflict, not just among nations, but among neighbors and even in homes. The red horse rides and brings conflict. And then there is the black horse. The black horse rides and brings famine and economic collapse. This always follows wars and conflict. We read about the rider of the black horse carrying scales, and scales were used, of course, to measure economy. They were used to measure food and money. And we read that this rider is carrying these scales, And then we read that the prices are shouted from heaven. A denarius for a quart of wheat. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, a denarius was a day's wages at that time. A quart of wheat was about a day's worth of food. And so what you read here is that the economy that has collapsed basically allows people to earn just enough to feed themselves for that day. That each day brings about the struggle of, will I have water to drink? Will I have food to eat? Now the question is, does that describe the world that we live in? Now it also says, do not touch the oil and the wine. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that people who are wealthy won't be impacted in the same way as the people who are poor. And so what you find in our world today is that the majority of the population of this planet lives on less than $3.20 a day. That's 80% of the population of this world lives on less than $10 a day. That 25,000 children on average die every day due to poverty. That more than a quarter of the population today is considered to be starving to death. And so you tell me if the black horse of famine and economic collapse is riding. Well, that leads to the fourth seal, and the fourth horseman riding the pale or the green horse. And the pale horse is death himself, and the grave follows after him. So there are these first four seals that are open, and I want you to catch this. I mean, this is both disturbing and comforting, that heaven allows it. Do you catch this? With the first horseman, he is given a bow. He is given a crown representing power. We read that the horseman riding the red horse is given a sword, that the horseman riding the black horse is carrying scales. But where do the prices come from? The prices are shouted down from heaven. And so John is reminding his readers of this both comforting and disturbing truth that God may not be causing these things, but He is allowing these horsemen to ride. And even though we don't always understand, even though it doesn't always make sense to us, God is on His throne and He is still in control even in the midst of tribulation. And so again, there are a number of different interpretations as to whether this suffering is coming or is currently being experienced. I mean, is this a coming tribulation or is it already happening? And my answer is yes. Yes, that we live in a time of tribulation, as has been the case since John's readers first received this, and we will continue to. And what we can expect is that things will get worse and not better before the return of Christ. Now again, for us, for many of us who are here today, we read and we interpret this differently than so much of the rest of the world. Because for many of us, and I know that there are exceptions, but for many of us, tribulation, we would have a hard time calling the tribulation that we experience being great. Now again, I know there are exceptions. I know that some of you have endured more than I could possibly imagine. But I also know that we have a tendency to allow our lives and our disappointment and our frustration to be determined by the things that are really quite trivial in the scheme of things. For many of us, our definition of tribulation is enduring a 20-minute wait at the restaurant before we can gorge ourselves on food. Or having a home game of our favorite sports team blacked out in our area because we can only get the updates on the internet or listen to the game on the radio instead of watching it. Or tribulation to some means having to settle for living in a 3-bedroom, 1.5-bath house with only a 2-car garage of all things, instead of a 5-bedroom, 3.5-bath house with a 4-car garage where we can park our 3 cars, 1 boat, and his or hers motorcycles. These things are not tribulation worthy, right? This is just trivial. No big deal. But have you noticed the tendency within us, so many of us, to just allow stuff like that to get to us? What's that say about our definition of challenge or of suffering? But look, though I know there are exceptions to this, I also know that, and I've spent time with people from around the world, that expect the suffering. They really don't know if they're going to live through the next day. And if you spent time with them, I dare say that you would describe what they're experiencing as tribulation. And you would likely put the word great in front of it. And so this is something that we see around the world. And what we can be sure of is that whether there is a literal 7-year tribulation or not, what we can be sure of is that before the return of Christ, things will get bad. And then they'll get worse. We read about the 5th and 6th seal, and they seem to reveal what happens just before the return of Christ. And each seal also kind of reveals a huge question that people ask during times of tribulation. It says, when he opened the 5th seal, this is verse 9, when he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained, the martyrs. They called out in a loud voice, how long? See, there's the question. How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Then each of them was given a white robe representing victory, and they were told to wait. How long? A little longer, until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and their sisters, were killed just as they had been. In other words, look, there is a set time here, and so you're going to have to wait a little longer. And one of the things that we've said in this series is that the most common word in Scripture used to describe the word of Christ is the word soon. Soon. How much longer? A little longer. When will he come? Soon. And so for those who are asking how much longer, God says, here's a white robe. Victory is certain, but you're going to have to wait a little longer. And the 6th seal, verses 12 through 17, seems to describe the end of the world. It says, I watched as he opened the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth, as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, everyone, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? And so what we're reading here seems to be the end of the world, the day of judgment. And the question is, who can withstand it? Who can survive it? Now, some people would say that John is witnessing here maybe a nuclear holocaust, and he's just trying to describe it in images that make sense to him. And so he talks about stars falling from the sky, but those are really nuclear-tipped missiles, some people say. And the sun becomes black, and that's as a result of the dust and debris from nuclear blasts. And the atmosphere is being pushed apart, as John describes it, but that's a nuclear explosion. Now, I don't know. Maybe so. But whatever the case, here's what is clear. Everything is destroyed. And everyone is affected by this 6th seal. And the question that we're left with is, who can stand? How are we going to get through this? And then we come to chapter 7. Philip Yancey tells about some Americans in World War II in a German prison camp who, unbeknownst to the guards, built a makeshift radio. And one day, news came over that radio that the German high command had surrendered, that the war was over. But because of a communication breakdown, the German guards in charge of that prison camp didn't have that news yet. And it wasn't until 4 days later that the Americans woke up to find that the Germans had fled and the gates were unlocked. And so they had 3 days where they knew that the war was over, but the German guards in charge of the camp, they didn't yet know that news. Well, these American prisoners were changed. I mean, they approached life differently in those 3 days because they knew. And so suddenly they waved to the guards all the time, and they laughed at the dogs, and they told jokes over meals, and they sang songs. They were still suffering, and they were still mocked and abused, but they changed. And why did they change? Because they knew salvation was sure and that it was soon. And so in Revelation chapter 6, we read about the suffering. We read about this tribulation. But in chapter 7, there is this news bulletin about the future. And John paints this picture in heaven of what one day will be for all of those. What am I trying to say here? He paints this picture of heaven of what one day will be for all of those who have, and all of those who are, and all of those who will suffer. And so in Revelation chapter 7, he says this, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every tribe, nation, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.' All the angels were standing around the throne and before the elders and the four living creatures. And they fell down on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, 'Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever.'" And so John paints this picture of great victory, of a great celebration, where people are wearing the white robes of victory, and they're waving palm branches indicating victory, and they're singing, "Salvation belongs to our God." So here it's coming. The war is technically over. You got some days left where those in charge may not realize it, but it's over. And so he describes this celebration. And then look at verses 15 through 17. "Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." And so John says, look, here's what's coming. And who can stand? God's people. That's who. And so what is the message here? I mean, I know that there's a lot that we can get caught up in, right? There's a lot of different terms and interpretations, but the message of Revelation continues to be very simple. If you're not ready, get ready, because Jesus is coming. If you are struggling and you are experiencing tribulation, then hold on, because Jesus is coming. John Ortberg tells about going to see Mabel. And he says that a lot of times he would go into this convalescent home that smelled of sickness and stale urine, and he would just sit by her bed and he would read scriptures to her. And she would just begin to recite them because she knew them by memory. And he said that he would open up a hymn book and he would begin to sing some hymns with her. And here's a lady who's completely blind, nearly deaf, but she sings along. And then she'll stop and say how one verse of that hymn is especially meaningful to her because of her life and what she's gone through. But she didn't talk about pain. She didn't talk about loneliness. She just talked about her longing for heaven. And so for 25 years, she lived strapped in this hospital bed. And one day he was sitting with her and he asked her, Mabel, what do you think about when you lay here, right? I mean, day after day, year after year, what do you think about when you lay here? And he had his pen and his paper out because he wanted to write it down. And she said, I think about my Jesus. And he said, well, what do you think about Jesus? And she said, oh, I think about how he has been so awfully good to me in my life. And she says, Jesus is all the world to me. And she began to sing that old hymn, Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day, without him I would fall. Mabel understands Revelation, that Jesus is our hope. So get ready and hang on, because he is coming. His coming is sure, and his coming is soon.
Time I face the waves, I don't wanna be afraid. I don't wanna be afraid. I don't wanna fear the storm just because I hear it roar. I don't wanna fear the storm. I don't wanna fear the storm. I'm not gonna be afraid. I'm not gonna be afraid, 'cause these waves are only waves. I'm not gonna be afraid. No, I'm not gonna be afraid. I'm not gonna fear the storm. You are greater than its roar. I'm not gonna fear the storm. No, I'm not gonna fear it all. faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Let's declare this right now, sing this out. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Peace be still, say the word, and I will set my feet upon the sea till I'm dancing in them deeper. Peace be still, you are here, so it is well. Even when my eyes can't see, I will trust the voice that speaks. Peace is over The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon